I am not a historian. I'm a journalist, and I'm not an expert on Lithuania or the Baltic states in general. However, I do know more about them than I knew a year ago or so when I embarked on writing a family memoir that I'm now getting close to completing. My forebears almost all came from Lithuania, and in fact my story is quite similar to Professor Polonsky's. My forebears came from northern Lithuania, from Šiauliai, what's now Šiauliai, and also from the small village of Zagare, very close to the Latvian border, also the birthplace of Nadine Gordimer's father. I guess thinking about it, I have one other reason to be vaguely qualified to be speaking in this debate, and that is that, curiously, I've found my career as a journalist, particularly in conflict zones. I covered the war in the Balkans, I covered the Bosnian War, and I've spent a long time covering conflict in the Middle East. And this has led me to reflect a lot about history, and more particularly about memory, and about the conflicting currents of memory, and how they can weigh so heavily on people that, far from being illuminating, history can be blinding. History can be blinding. I first saw this, I guess, in the Balkans, where, as you know, the terrible carnage of World War II, a clamp was simply placed over it once Tito took power. And when that clamp came off, memory was released. And it was released in such explosive fashion that more than 100,000 people paid with their lives in Europe. We saw concentration camps, not death camps, but concentration camps in Europe for the first time since World War II. And the Serbs, who were the chief perpetrators of the crimes, were so obsessed in their memories with their status as victims during World War II that they were blinded, in my view at least, to what was happening. And this was, I suppose, my first experience of competitive victimhood, what Professor Polonsky has called the Suffering Olympics, and the power of the dead. The power of the dead to exert influence over the living. And this, of course, is very much the case in the Middle East, where Yehuda Amichai, the Israeli poet, once remarked very accurately that the dead vote in Jerusalem. Whether the dead or the living have more influence in Jerusalem, for example, is an open question. And so in Lithuania, I guess, when I first went there, and it's not so long ago now, I found myself in a way on familiar terrain. The weight of history, the weight in particular on Lithuanians of this period of being triply occupied, first by the Soviets, then by the Nazis, then by the Soviets again, and then this Soviet clamp coming down on the country, much like that clamp I mentioned in Yugoslavia, which just froze history in many respects for 45 years. I felt again, as I felt previously, how distorting, how difficult it is to pick your way through these minefields and to disentangle facts and history from the emotion of memory and from myth. Well, with your forbearance, I was just going to read a brief passage from my book, because I think the town of Zagare, it's a village really, the village of Zagare, it does illustrate some of the questions we're concerned with today. So I'll just read briefly from this. The river Svete divides the town of Zagare into two halves. They're called the old and the new, but in truth there is not much to distinguish them. The sagging timber homes of the shtetl stand on either side, emptied of the Jews who built them. On the desolate market square is the greenhouse where the Brauber family lived. In the yellow house, the Zagorskis ran a shoe store near the bustling barber shop of the Yoffis. One or two prosperous families, the owner of the mill or the slaughterhouse, built in brick or stone rather than wood. Their status, so demonstrated, made no difference to their fate. To stay on in Zagare was to die. It is still and silent now in winter. Swift currents cut past patches of grey ice, The streets are empty, snow imparts its hush. The town is a palimpsest, the present inscribed in too faint a hue to efface a past of which nobody speaks. The past, the Jewish past, I see in black and white the square filled with horses and wagons laden with flax or hides, the stalls with their produce, the livestock corralled into small enclosures, the tradesmen placing goods on scales passed from father to son, the merchants offering menorahs and silver goblets and kettles and sewing machines and outsized transistor radios. I hear the tick-tock of old clocks. I see the work of the talith weavers. The hammer blows of small artisans and gravestone cutters reverberate. The murmurings of the teachers and Torah scribes, their sinuous argumentation with a familiar God, course down the narrow streets of a town once known as a center of Jewish learning and Kabbalism. The last Jew in Zagare, Isaac Mendelssohn, has died a few weeks before my arrival. So ends a presence that began in the 16th century. In 1897, 3 years after my grandmother Polly's birth in Zagare, there were 5,443 Jews in Zagare. Mendelssohn, a community of one, used to stand on the corner of the market square with his Dachshund, Kipper. He would recall the times after the war when he was a goalkeeper for the soccer team. Seldom, if ever, did he talk about the catastrophe. Catastrophe came to Zagare on October the 2nd, 1941. It was then that almost 2,500 Jews were slaughtered in a single day. The Soviet forces returning to Lithuania reached Zagare in 1944, and they found a mass grave in the woods. This is where my grandmother and the rest of my family would have lain had they not left for South Africa. And a Soviet special commission examined the remains. They determined there were 2,402 corpses, 530 men, 1,223 women, 625 children, and 24 babies. That showed a small discrepancy from the numbers given by SS Standartenführer Karl Jäger, who was chief of the German Security and SD Einsatzkommando 3, EK3, and he, in a report dated December 1, 1941, from Kaunas, stated that 2,263 Jews, not 2,402 as the Soviets said, 663 men, 1,107 women, and 496 children were executed in Zagare on October 2nd, 1941. Now Jäger at this time was in exultant mood. He was thrilled by what he'd accomplished. And he wrote, "I can confirm that our objective to solve the Jewish problem for Lithuania has been achieved by EK3. In Lithuania, there are no more Jews, apart from Jewish workers and their families." And that, as you know, was a reference to the ghettos that went on for a while in Vilnius, Kaunas, and my grandfather's town of Shavil, or Shole. Jäger said that he wanted to shoot everyone immediately. "I also intended to kill these Jewish workers," he wrote with evident regret, that came up against strong protest on the part of the civil administration and the Wehrmacht. For the Soviets, the discovery of this Jewish bodies was problematic. Stalin's aim was to forge Homo Sovieticus, not to forge Jewish identity. And Stalin would begin the process of identifying the Jews as, quote, rootless cosmopolitans, agents of American intelligence, and Jewish nationalists of his post-war propaganda. Jews, rather than victims of Nazism, became agents of an imperial conspiracy against communism. To sustain his victor's history, Stalin had to conjure Jews' particular suffering into the general, read Slavic and Russian sacrifice of the Great Patriotic War against Hitler. So the Jews in the Zagare ditch, or Ponary forest near Vilnius, and in countless other pits around Lithuania on the fringes of small provincial towns and villages were identified as Soviet victims of fascism. Any mention of the Jews after 1948 was inadmissible. And in this way, I think, this whole process of disentangling history and memory became immensely more complicated because Nazi propaganda was compounded by Soviet myth-making after the end of the war. That the Jews in the Zagare death pit should have been identified for a decade as Soviet citizens killed by fascism, rather than as Lithuanian Jews killed by Nazis and their local Lithuanian henchmen for the crime of their Jewishness, demonstrates an old truth that facts must serve ideology in the totalitarian world. Once Nazis and Stalinism met in their frenzied dance, death dance, in thrice-occupied Little Lithuania, the Jews there had to perish, and after death they had to be airbrushed from history for the ideologies to live. And of course, as you know, it's only since Lithuanian independence in 1990 that a memorial detailing the Nazi crimes in Zagari has gone up in the woods and in other towns where my grandmother used to pick cranberries. I remember always talking about the shpanguriu. I didn't know what this meant until I went to Lithuania and discovered it meant cranberries. And that plaque now reads, in this place, on October 1941, Nazi killers and their local helpers killed about 3,000 Jewish men, women, children from the Shaba region. And that little phrase, local helpers, remains controversial. Many Lithuanians, I think, would still rather see themselves as victims of the Soviets than as accomplices of the Nazis. They do not want to have been both, which is what I think they were, to have had a double identity in the inferno of triple occupation, first Soviet, then Nazi, then Soviet again. One thing I do know from my visit to Zagari, that my grandmother Polly, who would have been 47 in 1941, would have died in that massacre. So here we are with this fundamental question. Perpetrators and accomplices above all of the Nazis, or victims above all of the Soviets. How are Lithuanians to view themselves? And this is the controversy we are still in the midst of. And the whole double genocide theory has been immensely controversial. I think we've seen it this year. 70 members of the European Parliament, including 8 Lithuanians, signed a declaration objecting to, quote, attempts to obfuscate the Holocaust by diminishing its uniqueness and deeming it to be equal, similar, or equivalent to communism. And this prompted the former foreign minister, Azubalis, to blast these Lithuanian Social Democrats as pathetic. And his spokeswoman famously declared that the only difference between Hitler and Stalin was the length of their moustaches. Now, I interviewed the former Prime Minister, Andrius Kubilius, this year. He said there'd been a misunderstanding over Azubalis' remarks, and he said quote to me, it's absolutely clear that Holocaust crimes are unique crimes and terrible crimes. But he went on, it's obvious that Stalin's crimes were also very terrible and painful, although you cannot compare them. Well, I think you do have to compare them, and I, broadly speaking, come to, I think 7 points need to be made. I do think, I'm not with David Katz, who's been so relentlessly critical of Lithuanian attempts, which I think have been genuine and sustained, to try to confront, many years after the event, what happened in this small country. I think there's been a very serious attempt to do that. And I don't think there's any question about that. I also think that the efforts are still inadequate. The Museum of Genocide in Vilnius was referred to earlier. It devotes the vast bulk of its space to Soviet crimes against a valiant Lithuanian resistance. And I think that still reflects a skewed national psyche in Lithuania. On the other hand, I also think it's true that the Western appreciation, certainly the American appreciation in the US of Soviet crimes is paltry compared to recognition and memorialization of the Holocaust, and should, through education, be increased. I do think the Prague Declaration attempt to equate Nazi and Soviet crimes was misplaced, and that the Nazi ideology that led women and children to be shot in pits and created Auschwitz was unique in its murderous evil. Now, it may be that some Soviet crimes meet the UN definition of genocide, which is acts committed with intent to destroy, in whole or in part, a national, ethnical, racial or religious group as such. But I think the risk is that genocide risks losing its meaning, losing its gravity through overuse. I also think we're well past the time where there should be a Russian reckoning with Soviet crimes. That has been absolutely inadequate. And finally, I think it really was an act of genius to bring the Baltic states into the European Union. I mean, that's what the European Union has been in many ways. It's been an extraordinary means to overcome the wounds of history. And I think without the context of the European Union, and also of NATO, without that framework that sets a limit, in a way, on any further possible horrors, I don't think it would have been possible, given the weight of everything I've just described, I don't think it would have been possible to engage to the degree we have in open debate about these subjects. And to state the obvious, the more debate there is, the more education there is, the more views are batted back and forth, the better it is in the long run. It's when that clamp comes down on difficult memory that the situation becomes very dangerous. Now, I'll just say finally that since I wrote a column about my first visit to Zagreb, there was quite a big reaction from Jews throughout the world. There were forebears there who, didn't know what had happened to them, and this and that. And out of this, in small part, came a decision to put up a plaque this year, not in the woods, not on the outskirts of town, not in some remote place, but right there in the central square of Zagreb, to put up a plaque commemorating the murder of almost 2,500 Jews on October 2nd, 1941. I think this shows the distance there still is to travel. As far as I know, that is the first plaque that has been so placed in any town or village in Lithuania. And that, I think, is a sign of progress. And there was a very moving ceremony there. I'm going to conclude with a little bit of poetry. It's just a couple of lines. And it's from Amichai, who I mentioned earlier. And it's about our shared humanity and trying to see that through the maze of history. And Amichai writes, "Once I was sitting on the steps near the gate at David's citadel, and I put down my 2 heavy baskets beside me. A group of 12 tourists stood there around their guide, and I became their point of reference. You see that man over there with the baskets? A little to the right of his head, there's an arch from the Roman period. A little to the right of his head. But he's moving. I said to myself, redemption will only come when they are told, do you see that arch over there from the Roman period? It doesn't matter. But near it, a little to the left and then down a bit, there's a man who has just bought fruit and vegetables for his family."